The air in the cave is thick, a palpable soup of damp earth, unwashed bodies, cordite, and fear. It is late June 1945 on the island of Okinawa. The thunderous symphony of the American bombardment has momentarily faded to a dissonant orchestra of distant crumps and cracks of rifle fire. In the absolute pitch-black darkness, senses stretch to a breaking point. A Japanese soldier huddled behind a jagged limestone rock hears not just movement, but the unfamiliar, confident scuff of thick-soled American boots on stone. He sees the probing, terrifying beam of a flashlight cutting through the gloom like a physical blade. His finger trembles on the trigger of his Arisaka rifle. His mind, drilled in the absolute doctrine of Jyokusai, shattering like a jewel rather than surrendering, races through the final ritual, one last grenade or the cold kiss of his own bayonet. He steels himself for the final, brutal transaction of this war, death for death. But the voice that echoes down the stone corridor is not a roar. It is calm, almost conversational, amplified by a bullhorn. It speaks in formal schoolbook Japanese. "You are safe, the battle is over, come out and you will not be harmed." The beam of light settles not on him but on the cave floor, an invitation, not a target. Then a new shape emerges in the gloom, not a grenade. A small, rectangular object wrapped in wax paper skids across the rocky floor and comes to rest near his foot. He stares uncomprehending. An American voice, softer now, says a single alien word, "Chakorito." The soldier looks from the strange offering to the silhouette in the cave entrance, his entire understanding of war, of his enemy, of the very nature of conflict, teetering on the brink of an unimaginable abyss. This moment of profound, disorienting humanity did not occur in a vacuum. It was the fragile endpoint of the most savage campaign of the Pacific War, a clash that was the horrific culmination of years of escalating racial hatred and total war doctrine. To understand why a simple piece of chocolate could hold the power to shatter a soldier's will, one must trace the descent into the abyss that was the war in the Pacific. A path that led inexorably to the coral rocks and sugar cane fields of Okinawa. The road to Okinawa began not on an island map, but in the minds of men and the institutions they built. For Imperial Japan, the war that exploded at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was the violent harvest of a decades-long ideological cultivation. The Kokutai, the national polity, taught that Japan was a divine nation, uniquely pure and destined to lead Asia under the benevolent, semi-divine rule of the emperor. Every Japanese citizen was a child of the emperor, and the soldier was the ultimate filial servant. This was codified in the Senjinkan, the field service code issued in 1941, which stated unequivocally, "Do not suffer the disgrace of being taken alive." Surrender was not a tactical option. It was a spiritual corruption, a permanent stain on one's family, regiment, and the emperor himself. A soldier's duty was to achieve victory or die in the attempt, preferably taking 7 enemy lives in the process. This ideology was hammered into recruits through relentless, brutal training designed to break the individual and rebuild him as a component of the collective. The result was a military culture that viewed death as a positive good and mercy as a dangerous weakness. Confronting this was the United States, an industrial colossus roused to fury. The American way of war, particularly in the Pacific under the driven, pragmatic leadership of Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, was one of overwhelming material superiority applied with relentless, grinding force. The island-hopping campaign was a masterclass in logistical tyranny. Each captured atoll or island became a forward air and naval base, tightening a noose around Japan's resource lines and homeland. But this advance was paid for in blood on a shocking scale. Battles like Tarawa in 1943 revealed a horrifying new paradigm. The Japanese defender would not retreat, would not surrender, and would fight to the last man from incredibly sophisticated, interconnected fortifications. The American response evolved accordingly. War became an engineering problem to be solved with high explosives. Pre-invasion bombardments grew longer and heavier. Flame-throwing tanks, satchel charges, and naval gunfire were employed to systematically reduce fortified positions. It was a brutal elemental clash of philosophies. One side fought for an ideal of eternal honor and death, the other for a tangible objective, believing life was to be preserved when possible, but expending material without limit to protect it. By early 1945, this collision course was set for its final, most terrible impact point. The capture of Iwo Jima in March after 36 days of horrific fighting had provided a critical emergency landing strip for B-29's bombing Japan, but at a cost of nearly 7,000 US dead. The next step was Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands. For the Japanese, Okinawa was no outpost. It was part of the home archipelago, a sacred barrier to be defended at all costs. The Imperial Army prepared not for a battle but for a Jyokusai on a national scale, a glorious shattering. Their commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, adopted a strategy of profound patience and depth. Abandoning the costly, feudal banzai charges of earlier campaigns, he constructed a vast honeycombed network of defenses in the southern third of the island. Using the natural limestone caves, ridges, and tombs, his 110,000-strong 32nd Army created a fortress designed to bleed the Americans white, to make the cost of invasion so prohibitive that Washington might seek terms. They would let the Americans land, then draw them into a killing maze of mutually supporting positions where artillery, mortars, and machine guns could exact a monstrous toll. Opposing them was the newly formed U.S. 10th Army, a massive joint force of over 180,000 Army and Marine troops under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. Their mission, Operation Iceberg, was to seize the island for use as the final staging base for the inevitable invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for late 1945. The landings on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, were eerily unopposed on the beaches. But this quiet was a trap. As the Americans pushed inland and then turned south, they entered Ushijima's meticulously prepared killing ground. What followed was not a battle of maneuver, but a siege of attrition fought in mud under torrential rain and amidst some of the most concentrated Japanese artillery fire of the war. It was a preview of the invasion of Japan itself, a fact grimly understood by every man on the front lines, from the lowest private to the highest general. The stage was set for a collision of two worlds so fundamentally alien to each other that simple human gestures would become weapons of profound subversion. The battle unfolded as a slow-motion nightmare of attrition. Places with names like Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, and Shuri Castle became synonyms for carnage. The Japanese defense was cunning, resilient, and merciless. They had learned from their defeats. Instead of exposing themselves in suicidal charges, they fought from deep fortified positions, emerging at night to infiltrate American lines. The American advance was measured in yards per day, each one paid for with lives. The psychological environment was as brutal as the physical one. For the Japanese soldier, encircled and with no hope of reinforcement or victory, the Senjinkan Code was his only reality. To be captured meant torture, humiliation, and eternal dishonor. Propaganda depicted Americans as barbaric, keto-hairy beasts who would commit unspeakable atrocities upon prisoners. Many Japanese soldiers, believing this utterly, chose suicide. Some used their last grenade on themselves, others asked comrades to behead them. Countless more died in futile, last-ditch attacks. For the American GI or Marine, this fanatical resistance bred a combination of furious respect and deep-seated hatred. The enemy was invisible, popping up from spider holes and tunnel networks to kill, then disappearing. There was no safe rear area. The entire island was a front line. The relentless pressure, the constant casualties from mortar and artillery fire, and the sight of booby-trapped bodies and fake surrenders hardened many hearts. The rules of war in this context frayed at the edges. Yet within the U.S. military structure, a parallel, softer form of warfare was being systematically developed and deployed. This was the work of the Psychological Warfare Branch, PWB, and the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, composed largely of Nisei second-generation Japanese Americans whose loyalty was often cruelly questioned. The MIS linguists were the key. They translated captured documents, interrogated the few prisoners taken, and most importantly, crafted surrender appeals. These weren't crude propaganda blasts, they were carefully calibrated instruments. Using captured Japanese diaries and letters, the PWB crafted messages that spoke directly to the soldiers' hidden desires, for home, for family, for life. They dropped leaflets with safe conduct passes guaranteeing good treatment. They used powerful loudspeaker systems to broadcast at night, playing melancholic Japanese folk songs to trigger homesickness, followed by calm, rational appeals from the Nisei translators who sounded like fellow countrymen. They explained the hopelessness of the tactical situation, the fairness of the Geneva Conventions, and the simple human promise: you will be fed, you will be sheltered, you will see your family again. To a soldier steeped in a culture of death, these promises were not just attractive, they were revolutionary and thus deeply suspicious. The primary tool, however, was the behavior of the American infantryman himself after a position was overrun. This was where policy met the moment. The official U.S. directive was to take prisoners to demonstrate the truth of the leaflets and broadcasts. And so, squad leaders and platoon commanders, amidst the heat and rage of clearing a bunker, would sometimes have to enforce restraint to offer water, a cigarette, or a ration instead of a bullet. It was within this cauldron of extreme violence and carefully seeded humanity that the specific surreal moment of the chocolate offering became possible. By late June, the Japanese defensive lines had crumbled. General Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Cho, would commit ritual suicide on June 22. Organized resistance was collapsing into isolated pockets of holdouts hiding in the thousands of caves that pockmarked the southern coastline. The final phase was a grim, dangerous business of cave flushing. It was here, in the dark, intimate space of a limestone cavern, that the abstract psychological warfare became a tangible, personal encounter. The American soldier, weary to his bones, having lost friends to this unseen enemy, now had to peer into the black maw of a cave and call out an offer of life. And the Japanese soldier, starving, wounded, and waiting to die, had to make an impossible choice: to believe the promise of a hated enemy or to believe the absolute creed of his own nation. The outcome of this silent, internal battle would determine whether the cave's floor would be stained only with blood, or if a small, wax paper-wrapped token of a different world would be tentatively, disbelievingly, picked up. To comprehend the shock of the chocolate, one must first understand the mental prison from which the Japanese soldier had to escape. His will was not his own. It was a resource of the state, refined through a process of deliberate dehumanization. Recruit training was a prolonged ordeal of physical violence and psychological obliteration. Officers and senior enlisted men used relentless slapping, beatings, and humiliation to break down individual identity and instill instant, unconditional obedience. The individual was nakama nothing, the unit was everything. This was reinforced by the spiritual doctrine of Yamato Damasha, the Japanese spirit, which held that purity of will and fighting spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. From this flowed the tactical doctrine of the Jyokusai, the honorable death. Surrender made one Furio, a prisoner but also chosen, a coward and a traitor. The propaganda was total. Soldiers were told that if captured they would be tortured, their eyes gouged out, their bodies used for bayonet practice. The American was depicted as a monstrous subhuman creature incapable of honor or mercy. Thus, when a Japanese soldier found himself cornered, his cognitive universe offered only a menu of honorable deaths. To even consider the alternative was to betray everything he was, everything he knew. The chocolate, then, wasn't just food. It was a key to a door he had been told did not exist, offered by a monster he had been told would only offer the blade. In stark contrast stood the American infantryman, a creature of a profoundly different military culture. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps forged effective soldiers through discipline and training, but the ideal was not the obliteration of the self but the channeling of it. The GI was citizen first, soldier second. He fought for his country and his buddies beside him, motivated by a complex mix of patriotism, group loyalty, and a powerful desire to simply survive and go home. His relationship with his enemy was often defined by a brutal, professional hatred born of combat, but it was rarely ideological. He saw the Japanese soldier as a deadly, fanatical foe but still a man. The American military system, for all its industrial might, was ultimately a human-centric machine. It invested in things like penicillin, hot chow when possible, mail from home, and USO shows, small acknowledgments of the individual's need for sustenance beyond ammunition. This pragmatism extended to the treatment of prisoners. While atrocities occurred in the heat of battle, official policy was clear: take prisoners for intelligence and treat them correctly to encourage more surrenders. The chocolate in a K-ration or D-ration bar was a standard piece of this sustenance economy. To the GI, offering it to a starving, defeated enemy was not an act of profound moral courage. It was often a simple, almost reflexive gesture, a way to ease a tense surrender, to humanize the terrifying figure in the cave, or just to get the job done with less hassle. Its profound impact lay in its very casualness. The gesture of the chocolate, while sometimes spontaneous, was part of a larger, meticulously planned campaign to dismantle the Japanese will to fight from the inside. The psychological warfare branch on Okinawa operated with near-scientific precision. Nisei linguists like those of the 306th MI detachment were its most vital weapon. They would be brought to cave mouths and, using bullhorns, engage in direct dialogue with holdouts. Their scripts were masterpieces of reverse engineering the Senjinkan. They did not insult the soldier's honor, they redefined it. You have fought bravely for your emperor, your duty is complete. Now it is your duty to your ancestors to live and return to Japan. They leveraged the deep cultural respect for education, speaking in the polite, formal tones of a teacher or official. They assured soldiers their families would be told they were alive, circumventing the shame of a reported death in battle. The safe conduct passes on leaflets were designed to look like official military documents, providing a bureaucratic permission slip to surrender. The chocolate, the cigarettes, the canned beef, these were the physical proofs of the PWB's verbal promises. When a Nisei voice said, "You will be fed," and then a GI tossed a ration, it created a powerful, undeniable congruence. The psychological operation sought to create a cognitive dissonance so severe it would crack the ideological shell. The enemy they had been taught to fear was offering kindness. The act they had been taught was treasonous resulted in care, not torture. The object itself, the chocolate bar, was a potent symbol of the industrial and cultural gulf between the two armies. The Japanese soldier's sustenance was the higashi, A simple, functional rice ball, sometimes flavored with pickled plum or wrapped in seaweed. It was the food of home of a peasant-based economy carried in a cloth and often scarce. By the Battle of Okinawa, supply lines were severed, and many Japanese soldiers were starving, surviving on stolen sweet potatoes or whatever they could scavenge. Their existence was one of austerity and scarcity, mirroring the national ideology of spiritual purity through material denial. The American D-ration chocolate bar, by contrast, was a marvel of industrialized food science. Developed to be high-calorie, vitamin-fortified, and resistant to melting, it was a dense utilitarian slab of energy. But to the Japanese soldier it represented something unimaginable, a luxury. Here was an army that could afford to manufacture, ship across an ocean, and distribute to every single soldier a sweet, rich food item with no nutritional purpose other than morale and quick energy. The chocolate bar was a tactile piece of evidence of America's bottomless logistical wealth. It spoke of a country so rich it could fuel its soldiers with candy while waging war. Accepting it was not just eating food, it was ingesting a piece of this alien, overwhelming reality, a reality where comfort was considered a standard of war. For the Japanese soldier shrouded in cave darkness, the American had no human face. He was a silhouette, a terrifying voice shouting in a guttural language, the source of impersonal, annihilating firepower from ships and planes. The propaganda image of the monstrous Kido was a defense mechanism against this unknown. The moment of surrender shattered this abstraction. Up close, the American was a young man, as weary and dirty as he was. He had a face perhaps tense, perhaps curious, perhaps even offering a tentative smile. The act of offering chocolate or a cigarette or a canteen of water was an act of individuation. It was a personal transaction, not an ideological one. The Japanese soldier, conditioned to expect brutality, was disarmed by banality. The American might fumble with the ration package, make a simple hand gesture, say a word he'd been taught like taburo, eat. In that clumsy, human interaction, the demon vanished. The enemy became a specific person performing a specific, kind act. This personalization was devastating to the rigid group identity framework of the Japanese soldier. It was far harder to sustain a hatred for a faceless empire when one of its representatives was handing you a piece of candy. The chocolate became a bridge between two individuals, momentarily bypassing the vast apparatus of state hatred that had brought them to that cave. In the brutal calculus of the Pacific War, the exchange was shockingly asymmetrical. The Japanese soldier was prepared to trade his life for a marginal, often symbolic, tactical gain, to kill one more enemy, to delay an advance for minutes. His currency was his own existence. The American, in offering chocolate, was trading a negligible piece of his immense logistical surplus for the potential gain of a human life, intelligence, and the slow erosion of the enemy's collective will. It was the ultimate demonstration of confidence, even arrogance. It said, "We have so much, we can afford this gesture, your death is not even necessary to us." But on a human level, it was also a restoration of a basic moral order that war seeks to obliterate. In the midst of a campaign defined by flamethrowers, mass artillery barrages, and mutual annihilation, this was a reassertion of a simpler, older code: you feed the hungry, you show mercy to the defeated. For the surrendering soldier, this was perhaps the most profound shock of all. The war, as taught to him, was a spiritual contest with no room for such sentiments. Yet here they were, embodied in a cheap confection. He had been prepared for every form of violence, but he was utterly unprepared for a moment of unsolicited, non-transactional decency. In that instant, the entire moral architecture of his war, the honor of death, the dishonor of capture, was called into question by the sweet, unfamiliar taste melting on his tongue. The climax of the Battle of Okinawa was not a single event, but a slow, grinding collapse, a psychological avalanche triggered by the relentless pressure of American arms and the persistent, whispering voice of an alternative. By late June 1945, the Shuri Line, the formidable defensive backbone of the Japanese 32nd Army, had been shattered. General Ushijima's command post had been abandoned, and the remaining forces were fractured into disorganized pockets, driven into the labyrinthine cave systems and ravines of the island's southern tip. The organized battle was over. What remained was a deadly, intimate cleanup operation the Americans called mopping up. This was the crucible where the theories of psychological warfare would be tested in thousands of individual life-or-death encounters. The turning point was not marked by a flag raising but by a change in the rhythm of the killing. The sharp, definitive cracks of rifle shots killing holdouts began to be punctuated by something new, moments of silence followed by the emergence of haggard, often wounded men from cave mouths, their hands empty or raised, blinking in the harsh sunlight. For the American frontline units, orders were explicit: encourage surrender where possible. The methods evolved into a grim routine. A cave would be identified. First, a blunt offer, calls to surrender via bullhorn from an Issei interpreter, often amplified by loudspeaker. If silence or gunfire answered, the offer would be followed by violent persuasion. Satchel charges, gasoline pumped in and ignited, or demolitions to seal the entrance. But increasingly, the first option was yielding results. Squads developed a tactic. They would secure the area around a cave, then settle in for a strange, patient siege. They would call out, then wait. They might toss in cigarettes or cans of food before any response was given, as a gesture of good faith. They learned that rushing meant death from a booby trap or a final, desperate charge. The key was to allow the psychological pressure inside the cave to build. The pressure of hunger, thirst, wound infection, and the terrifying, seductive alternative to a lonely death. Inside, the Japanese soldiers faced their ultimate crisis of faith. The group dynamic that had enforced the Senjinkan Code was broken. Often, only a handful of men remained from a company. In the dark, arguments would fester. Some would insist on a Jyokusai. Others, weaker from hunger or less ideologically committed, would voice the heresy: what if the Americans are telling the truth? The decisive moment in each cave was a solitary, internal fracture. It was the moment a single soldier, perhaps the youngest or the one with the most severe wound, decided his duty to his own life outweighed his duty to a dead-end code. He would lay down his rifle or simply begin to shuffle toward the light. His action was a catalyst. It gave permission to others. Sometimes it sparked violence within the cave, a loyalist killing the would-be surrenderee before he could move. But just as often, it created a fragile consensus. They would emerge not in a group, but one by one, often in a daze, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The first sight that greeted them was not a firing squad, but a line of American soldiers, weapons trained but not firing. And then would come the gestures. A medic might be waved forward to tend to a wound. A canteen of water would be offered. And then often from a young GI's pocket would come the chocolate bar or a pack of gum. The transaction was silent, profound. The American proved the promise of the leaflets and broadcasts was real, not with words but with action. The Japanese soldier, in accepting, performed his first act as a prisoner. He chose to trust the enemy. In that exchange, the entire ideological construct of a glorious death evaporated, replaced by the simple, profound relief of being alive, and the shocking discovery that the world beyond the cave was not one of unrelenting horror, but of a bizarre, unsettling normality. This process was not uniform, nor was it clean. For every cave where surrender was negotiated, there were others where the old logic held until the end, culminating in a final, fiery detonation. But the frequency of surrenders in late June began to accelerate in a way that was statistically undeniable and psychologically transformative for both sides. The Americans, hardened by months of seeing the enemy only as fanatics who would pretend to surrender only to detonate a grenade, began to recalibrate their expectations. The sight of a genuinely broken, grateful prisoner started to chip away at the monolithic hatred. For the Japanese holdouts, the evidence mounted not from propaganda but from their own senses. From adjacent caves, they might hear not the sounds of execution, but the calm voices of Americans and the subdued responses of their former comrades. They might even catch a glimpse through a crevice, a captured soldier sitting in the open, being given a cigarette, his uniform still on, his body intact. This visual proof was more powerful than any leaflet. The rumor network among the isolated pockets began to carry a new, subversive message. The Americans are not killing prisoners. They are feeding them. The ultimate testament to this turning point was the sheer, unprecedented number of captives. In the early, vicious stages of the battle, prisoners were a rarity, often only taken because they were too wounded to kill themselves. By the final week, U.S. regiments were processing dozens, then hundreds per day. On June 21st, the same day, General Buckner was killed by Japanese artillery. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers and conscripted Okinawans surrendered. The climax was the mass surrender orchestrated not by infantry, but by the psychological warfare teams themselves. In one of the war's most surreal episodes, Nisei sergeants like John Tanikawa and George Oi, armed only with loudspeakers and sheer nerve, would approach vast cave complexes known to hold hundreds of holdouts. They would broadcast messages for hours, sometimes days, engaging in shouted conversations, answering questions about treatment, and patiently waiting. They became known as the Cave Flushers. Their greatest success came at the end. In the final days, they convinced large groups, sometimes 50, 100, even 200 at a time, to walk out peacefully. These were not assaults but negotiated conclusions. The weapon that secured these surrenders was not the flamethrower but the demonstrated truth of American mercy, with the chocolate bar as its most potent, tangible symbol. The war on Okinawa ended not with a final, cataclysmic banzai charge, but with a ragged, hungry procession of men emerging from the earth, choosing the uncertain kindness of the enemy over the certain nobility of death. The ideological fortress had been breached, not by force alone, but by the confounding power of a simple, unexpected act of humanity. The raw arithmetic of Okinawa's aftermath was staggering, a ledger written in blood and steel. When organized resistance ceased on June 22, 1945, the cost was calculated with grim precision. The United States suffered over 49,000 casualties, including more than 12,500 killed or missing. The Navy endured its highest losses of the war, with nearly 10,000 casualties and 36 ships sunk, most to the torment of the kamikaze aerial corps. But the Japanese toll was of a different magnitude. Of the approximately 110,000 soldiers of the 32nd Army, fewer than 7,400 were taken prisoner by the battle's end, and thousands of those surrendered in the final days. The rest, over 100,000 men, lay dead. Perhaps most horrifying was the fate of the Okinawan civilians, caught between the grinding millstones. Estimates suggest between 100,000 and 150,000 perished, a third or more of the island's pre-war population, from artillery barrages, crossfire, mass suicides encouraged by Japanese soldiers, or simply starvation in the caves. The island itself was a wasteland. Villages were obliterated, the ancient castle of Shuri was dust, and the landscape was so churned by shells it was described as a chopped moon. The victory was total, but it felt Pyrrhic. The base was secured for the invasion of Japan, but the price had been so high it cast a long, dark shadow over all future planning. For the American High Command, the battle provided terrifying, tangible data for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The ratio of casualties on Okinawa, where defenders were dug into rugged terrain, was extrapolated to the mountains and plains of Kyushu and Honshu. Intelligence indicated the Japanese were mobilizing the entire population, men, women, and children, into a national militia, promising a fight to the death. Projected American casualties ranged from 250,000 to over 1 million. The fanatical resistance, even in the face of certain defeat, confirmed every worst fear. Yet simultaneously, Okinawa offered a faint alternative glimmer. The surge of surrenders at the very end, triggered by psychological tactics and merciful treatment, suggested a crack in the monolithic Japanese resolve. It proved that under the right conditions, the individual soldier's will to live could overcome his indoctrination. This contradictory lesson, of both unprecedented fanaticism and its potential collapse, hung heavily in the war rooms as President Truman received news of the successful Trinity atomic test in July. The decision to use the new weapon would be influenced by many factors, but the memory of Okinawa's corpse-strewn ridges was a fresh and potent one, a vision of the conventional alternative. For the Japanese prisoners of war, the aftermath was a journey into a bewildering new world. Processed through holding camps, they were treated with a clinical correctness that was in itself a shock. They were deloused, given medical care, fed regularly, not with rice balls but with tinned meat, bread, and yes, more chocolate or candy. The systematic, impersonal kindness was as confusing as the impulsive gift in the cave. They were interrogated not with torture but with questionnaires and calm conversation by the Nisei linguists, who often served as cultural bridges explaining the strange American ways. Many prisoners expecting execution or slavery were visibly stunned by the routine. Their testimonies, dutifully recorded by intelligence officers, reveal a common thread, a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. They spoke of their disbelief that the enemy could be so gentlemanly, a word that appears repeatedly in the reports. They confessed their prior belief in the propaganda of American barbarism. One prisoner, a private from Hiroshima, stated plainly, "We were told you would torture us, you gave us food instead. We did not understand this war." The aftermath within Japan itself was one of suppressed reality and deepening gloom. The military government, reeling from the loss of Okinawa, now branded not a defeat but a magnificent Gyokusai, tightened its control over information. The public was told of a heroic, sacrificial stand that had inflicted catastrophic losses on the Americans, buying precious time for the defense of the homeland. The stories of mass surrender, of chocolate and kindness, were buried utterly. To admit such things would have been to undermine the very foundation of the Kokutai and the spirit of total resistance. Yet, a whisper network began among the few repatriated wounded and the military elite who understood the true numbers. The scale of the American material advantage, the sheer tonnage of explosives dropped on the island, and the horrifying efficiency of their logistics became an open secret in high circles. The fall of Okinawa meant American bombers and submarines could now strangle the home islands with impunity. The nation was being systematically pulverized from the air and sea, and the final battlefield had been moved to Japan's doorstep. For the individual Japanese soldier who had surrendered, his personal war was over, but a profound internal conflict was just beginning. In the prisoner of war camps on Guam, Leyte, and later in the United States, they grappled with immense shame and dislocation. They had broken the ultimate taboo. Yet as they were treated humanely, fed, and allowed to organize educational and recreational activities, a new perspective slowly, painfully emerged. Many participated in re-education programs where the nature of the militarist government and the realities of the war were discussed. For some, this sparked a crisis of faith. For others, it was a slow awakening. They began writing letters home which were delivered through the Red Cross, another shock to families who had likely already received official notice of their son's glorious death. These men became living ghosts, embodiments of a choice the state said did not exist. Their very existence and their testimony of good treatment would later become a critical tool during the occupation, proving to a shattered nation that the Americans were not the demons of propaganda, but a power capable of both devastating wrath and astonishing, disciplined mercy. The final, strategic aftermath of the Okinawa campaign was written in fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 6 weeks later. The debate over the necessity of the atomic bombs will forever be intertwined with the shadow of Okinawa. To the American planners, the equation was brutally clear. If a peripheral home island defended by 110,000 soldiers could cost 12,500 American lives and months of horrific fighting, the cost of invading the main islands against millions of mobilized defenders was unthinkable. The chocolate offered in the caves represented a path to surrender that worked on the scale of dozens, then hundreds. But it was too slow, too fragile, and had come only after the vast majority had chosen death. Faced with the prospect of repeating Okinawa 100-fold, the atomic bomb appeared as a terrible but decisive alternative to force a national surrender where individual appeals had failed. In a tragic irony, the very fanaticism displayed on Okinawa, which had begun to crack at the individual level, helped justify the use of a weapon of mass destruction to break the national will. The kindness that ended the battle for some was overshadowed by the unimaginable violence chosen to end the war for all. The chocolate bar in the dark cave is more than an anecdote. It is a fossil of a fleeting alternative history. It represents a moment where the monolithic narratives of total war, the clash of civilizations, the inevitability of annihilation, fractured to reveal a simpler human truth. In the grand, tragic sweep of the Pacific War defined by industrial slaughter and ideological hatred, this small act of unsolicited decency stands as a radical anomaly. It proved that even in the most absolute of conflicts, the binary of kill or be killed could be interrupted, if only for a second, by a third option: see and be seen as human. The profound shock experienced by the Japanese soldier was not merely about sustenance or even mercy. It was the shock of encountering a different moral universe. His entire framework for understanding the war, painstakingly constructed by the state, had no category for this gesture. The chocolate was an object from a world where life was valued over honor, where comfort was not a sign of weakness but of strength, and where an enemy could possess a capacity for kindness. This dissonance was a weapon more disarming than any flamethrower, for it attacked the very reason to fight. The battle for Okinawa was ultimately won by superior firepower and grim determination. But its final lingering note was not the roar of guns, but the quiet sound of a wax paper wrapper being unfolded in a dark place, a sound that heralded the end of one world and the reluctant, bewildering birth of another. In that simple, sweet offering lies a timeless lesson, that the most powerful force in warfare may not be the will to destroy, but the courage, however spontaneous or calculated, to offer a piece of common humanity instead.